Attacking a country's economy.
The use of sanctions is a way to hit your adversary where it hurts, in the pocket.
It's something to do, right, short of going to war.
As Russia faces an international effort to pile on the pressure
Without using direct military means, let's look at how sanctions have been used in the past and their impact.
There has been a huge economic downturn. And then there's the damage that is done to civil society, to society writ large.
In this video, we'll ask whether sanctions actually work.
When you impose sanctions, affects the people, but it doesn't give a way out to the situation. I think that sanctions tend to radicalize the status quo.
And look at the creative ways that countries are finding to get around them.
China and Russia have, for a very long time, and quite willfully, I believe, deliberately helped North Korea to circumvent the sanctions.
Now that Russia is facing its own torrent of restrictions from the rest of the world, what can we expect? Find out on Business Beyond.
So let's start with the basics. What are sanctions?
Well, the term covers a whole range of measures an organisation like the United Nations or European Union or a single country can take against the government, citizens or businesses of another country.
The aims of economic sanctions can be pretty large, right? But at the end of the day, what you're attempting to do is to coerce another state to change its behaviour in some fundamental way.
Sanctions come in all kinds of forms, including bank account freezes, travel bans, restrictions on selling certain goods to a country, like weapons, or on buying certain goods from them, like oil and gas.
They are a powerful tool. And in a way, it is a step forward after the diplomatic tools fail, right? But it's a step behind a military action. So it's something in the middle. And in a way, it's to avoid a military conflict or try to avoid a military conflict, and also try to send a message to other countries.
Sanctions are just one tool in the coercion toolbox, alongside diplomacy and, of course, use of your armed forces. And the use of sanctions in recent years has shown that they are a tool, when used right, that can cut deep.
There's a perception that economic statecraft or coercive economic statecraft, is less harmful, right? Less bloodshed. And that's true. That's true in the sense that bullets aren't flying and people aren't dying. But there are real effects, real economic effects that touch on people's lives.
No country has felt the impact of international sanctions more severely than the pariah state of North Korea. North Korea has been under trade sanctions from the US since the Korean War way back in the 1950s. But it's in the 21st century that the international community has turned up the heat. The main aim? To end North Korea's development of nuclear weapons.
The country, conducted its first nuclear test in 2006, and subsequently the UN Security Council began to impose initially targeted financial sanctions.
We've had 6 other resolutions since then. Those have progressively imposed an arms embargo, bans on certain North Korean exports, including coal, minerals, and believe it or not, food. They export seafood, exports of North Korean forced laborers, and then finally, and most importantly, limits on North Korean finance and use of the financial system.
That's Joshua Stanton. He's an attorney, and he helped the United States Congress to formulate the US sanctions against North Korea over its nuclear program and alleged crimes against humanity.
What these really add up to are there is really no official bilateral trade between the United States and North Korea. North Korea isn't supposed to have access to the global financial system.
In the years that followed the introduction of US sanctions in 2017, their impact became apparent, particularly on the North Korean elites.
The price of an apartment in Pyongyang in some of the elite districts fell by 80%. We saw more cases of elite defections. We saw that some of the Chinese banks were avoiding business with North Koreans. Joint enterprises in places like Rason were suddenly deserted. There was much, much less commerce visible in Dandong, which is a border town. Forced laborers were returning home or unable to pay their so-called loyalty kickbacks to the state. There was really a wide range of effects that were observable.
One of the criticisms of economic sanctions is that, like military weapons, they can hurt innocent civilians.
North Korea is thought to be going through its worst economic crisis since the 1990s, when famine killed millions of people. Aid agencies like UNICEF say international sanctions are hampering the humanitarian effort to help North Koreans, even despite exemptions for things like food and medical goods.
And while ordinary people are suffering, the regime that the sanctions are supposed to be hurting the most is finding ways around them.
I sat on the UN panel of experts to investigate sanctions evasion, North Korean sanctions evasion activity, and report that to the Security Council. North Korea has established relatively effective sanctions evasion methods and techniques.
So Kim Jong-un's regime is continuing to test ballistic missiles of ever-increasing ranges. Therefore, can we say that the international sanctions have been a success?
If the success is to slow down the rate of proliferation or to increase the cost premium for North Korea to launder its money, they have been a limited success in persuading Kim Jong-un that clinging to nuclear weapons is a threat to the stability of the state, and that is the only motive that will disarm him. They have not succeeded.
Now let's turn to South America. Venezuela, once the continent's richest country, has also been a major target of US sanctions.
The Venezuelan government has been accused of human rights violations, of being involved in narcotics trafficking, financial crimes, and what the US calls insufficient cooperation in the targeting of terrorism. And it's for that reason it's been the subject of a series of rounds of sanctions by the US since 2006.
But amid months of intense anti-government protest in Venezuela in 2017, with more than 100 demonstrators killed as the state cracked down, the US ratcheted up sanctions in a campaign to maximize pressure on Nicolas Maduro's government. The US cut off Venezuela's access to the American financial system, barred transactions with its state oil company, PDVSA, and significantly expanded personal sanctions against figures connected to Maduro.
The goal was regime change, but with Maduro's continuing hold over the country, it hasn't worked. There is a theory that the longer sanctions are in place, the less powerful they become.
He replaced his relation with the US or other countries, and he tries to get closer to the Russian Federation, maybe Iran, which is also under sanctions, and they are still there, right? And some other countries like that. So they tend to build a new group of sanction targeting countries.
As long-standing as US sanctions against Venezuela have been, the US boycott of Cuba has been for a lot longer.
It's half a century, more than 50 years since Cuba was under sanctions.
In fact, the US embargo against Cuba marked 60 years this year. It was on the 3rd of February 1962 that President John F. Kennedy signed a decree banning bilateral trade with Cuba, penalizing the country over its links with communist regimes like China and the Soviet Union.
There was a time when it looked like the 60-year anniversary wouldn't happen. In the last months of his leadership, former President Barack Obama made a historic visit to Havana.
I have come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas. But my time here in Cuba renews my hope and my confidence in what the Cuban people will do. We can make this journey as friends and as neighbors and as family, together. Sí se puede. Muchas gracias.
But the normalization of US-Cuba relations was quickly rolled back under Trump, who reimposed and widened the sanctions, despite widespread recognition of their failure to achieve key policy aims like promoting democracy.
Maybe that will be the best example to say that sanctions in the long term, they are losing power. And they could maybe work if a country is whether a democratic country or moving towards democracy. But in authoritarian regimes, seems like the situation is different.
Often sanctions provide particularly one-party governments with a scapegoat for their citizens' hardships.
Eso no va a ser un problema nosotros. Los americanos están luchando por jodernos, pero nosotros no vamos a ceder. Vamos a seguir para adelante para que todo el mundo coja lo que tiene que coger. Y no los vamos a parar, ni los van a vencer tampoco.
Al no entrar petróleo, el país lo paraliza. Entonces, eso es lo que ellos están buscando. Entonces, aquí nuestros dirigentes están buscando la forma de ir regulando. ¿Tú me entiendes? Para nosotros ir pasando toda la serie de cosas que hemos pasado muchísimas y hemos ido hacia adelante. ¿Me entiendes? Porque esta sola no es una pila y no es de ahora, hace rato.
The United Nations has said that the US embargo on Cuba has cost the country's economy $130 billion over nearly 6 decades. That's in line with the island nation's own estimates.
Let's turn our attention to another major target for international sanctions, Iran.
There is a host of sanctions that has been put on Iran for more than the past decade, starting with sanctions for human rights violations, individuals which have been listed and whose accounts have been frozen, to broad economic sanctions from oil and gas exports, which are restricted to specific industries like steel or precious metals. And even the Iranian central bank has been put under sanctions at the height of the nuclear crisis.
Leading the way with the sanctions against Iran was once again the United States. The US sanctioned over 650 Iranian individuals and institutions under the Obama administration. That was before the US unilaterally withdrew from the so-called Iran nuclear deal under President Donald Trump. He effectively abandoned negotiations with Tehran over its atomic weapons plans in favour of a much tougher sanctions regime. The Trump administration hit another 960 individuals and institutions with restrictions.
Iranian banks were also kicked out of the SWIFT international banking messaging system for the second time, something that Russian banks are now having to reckon with. The impact of the increased sanctions regime on Iran was enormous.
There has been a huge economic downturn. The Iranian companies that had to cut business with European ones in particular made losses. They had to redirect their trade. They incurred costs in order to avoid or evade sanctions. And then there's the damage that is done to civil society, to society writ large. People who cannot travel, who cannot visit their relatives, people who have to do 2 or 3 jobs in order to make a living because the currency has nosedived. So there is a huge effect all in all that one can see.
However, Iran has also been able to find ways around some of the restrictions. It's still managing to export its most important product.
China is Iran's biggest customer for oil. In fact, it's importing more Iranian oil now than it was before the sanctions were put in place, some 800,000 barrels per day during January of 2022. Iranian oil has been arriving in China in recent years, marked as coming from countries like the United Arab Emirates, Oman, or Malaysia.
This is just another example of a sanctioned country turning to China or another sanctioned state to find a way round international restrictions. So once again, we have to ask, are the sanctions achieving what they set out to achieve?
Ironically, the Iran case, where the nuclear deal was struck, including because of internationally coordinated sanctions, the Iran case was taken as a good example of how sanctions can work. Now look at what happened after the deal was struck. The United States pull out without Iran giving them reason to do so. And has imposed its own what is called maximum pressure regime of sanctions, but in effect taking European companies along because they had to abide by US legislation. So what one can see now is a hardening of the regime, an increase of the nuclear program, precisely in the face of sanctions. So Iran doesn't make a good case in favor of sanctions anymore at this point.
You might have noticed a thread through this video: the involvement of the United States.
Over recent decades, the United States has established itself as the world's Sanctioner-in-Chief. It's deployed the weapon more often and with greater force than any other single nation. So why is that?
After the wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, there has been a tendency in the United States to, lash out at whatever foe, enemy, antagonist they find through sanctions, especially financial sanctions. That's because the United States is at the heart of the financial system worldwide. So if someone is barred from making dollar transactions, an individual or an institution, then they really can't do global business.
So having now looked at some of the targets of sanctions from the US and from the UN, the EU and other nations, can we conclude whether sanctions actually work?
Research has actually been done into this. The Peterson Institute for International Economics looked at over 200 cases where sanctions were used. It concluded they were overall at least partially successful around a third of the time, 34%. But the success rates depended greatly on what a government was trying to achieve. If it was to force through a modest policy change, such as securing the release of a prisoner, the sanctions had some success more often than not. But if the aim was something larger, like disrupting a military adventure, like Russia invading Ukraine, the success rate was a lot lower.
Sanctions can work very well if you're doing a few things right. Number one, you have to enforce them. Number two, I think this is the lesson of Cuba, you can't do it unilaterally. You need to do it in concert with partners. And number three, you have to really aim at goals.
The main principle is that they can work in the short run. I mean, if they are imposed quickly, swiftly, and harshly, then they might work because of them having a real effect, an immediate effect. The longer they last, the less likely they are to be successful.
So will the short, sharp shock of the sanctions imposed on Russia be enough to change President Putin's military ambitions? Well, there is cause for hope.
What we have seen recently with Russia and the Ukraine is, in fact, a well-coordinated, multilateral, international, coalition-based strategy to force Russia through economic pressure to change its behavior. This is exactly what we should have done years ago in North Korea.
The lessons learned from sanctions past include the fact that little is achieved with sanctions alone.
Sanctions are more symbolic than effective. They send a strong message, right? You are on the wrong path. You have to reverse course. But only sanctions? No.
If you go into it believing that sanctions is just one side of the coin, it's just one tool in your toolbox, and that you still need to achieve the outcomes through diplomacy, that this is just your source of leverage, I think that you can achieve a far higher success rate. And I think that the U.S. and its allies would be wise to approach sanctions from that perspective.
We've heard sanctions described as one step short of war, but many of us are hoping the sanctions against Russia can walk Ukraine back to a state of peace.
And that's all from this edition of Business Beyond. For more from us, why not check out our playlist? Perhaps start with our video about the impact of inflation around the world at the moment. Remember to hit like and subscribe if you've enjoyed what you've seen. Until next time, take care.